In your adventuring career, you're going to go down into a dungeon or maybe one of your favorite forest spots where enemies are, or even just around town, and you might run into a hazard. You can run into traps, you can run into environmental conditions, or you could run into that spooky ghost that acts as a hazard. Hazards can definitely be something that can be a pain to deal with, but there are always ways around them. And if you have the right trained people with you, you can disarm them, to disable them, or even destroy them. So, my name is Don. I'm trying to be the Sly Strategist, and let's go ahead and get into it. So, I want to start with a little bit of hazards and haunts overview. I did do a hazard video before, and I was going to do haunts separately, but you know what? It's kind of hard to do haunts separately because haunts are just a type of hazard. So, what I'm kind of going to do is I'm going to redo the hazard video, add the haunt section to it, and take the old hazard video down. That way we kind of get all the information in one spot. I don't have links here and there and cards and references in the description to go to. So we're just going to kind of talk all about it right here in this video. So as mentioned, you are going to run into various hazards throughout your adventuring career, and they all have some things in common, but it depends on whether they are a simple hazard or a complex hazard. They might have some different traits. But let's go ahead and define what a hazard actually is. So, a hazard is going to have a trigger of some sort that sets whatever danger it has in motion. For traps, it could be a mechanism like a tripwire or a pressure plate, while for an environmental hazard, it might just be proximity, or for a haunt, it could be about the same. It could just be proximity or the fact that you walk through a haunted door and it's going to close behind you. When characters approach a hazard, they have a chance to find the trigger area or the mechanism before triggering the hazard. So you might see the tripwire, you might see the pressure plate, you might see the mud pit, or you might hear, see, or feel just a little cold spot where the ghost might be if it's a haunt. The player characters automatically receive a check to detect hazards unless the hazard has a required minimum proficiency rank to do so. If it does not have a required minimum proficiency rank, you will get an automatic DC check. However, if it does have a minimum proficiency rank, then it needs to be done explicitly. So during exploration, you can determine whether the party detects a hazard when the player characters first enter the general area in which it appears. If the hazard doesn't list a minimum proficiency rank, you roll a secret perception check against the hazard's stealth DC for each player character. Now, all of the hazards, especially simple hazards, are going to have just a stealth DC. Some you might see a stealth DC in a complex hazard, and that will actually be for initiative, but we're going to go ahead and get into that in a little bit. But now, talking about hazards with a minimum proficiency rank, roll only if someone is actively searching, using the seek action in an encounter, something along those lines, and only if they have the listed proficiency rank or higher in whatever it is going to be. It could be perception, it could be crafting, it could be whatever it might be, and they have to have that listed proficiency. Now, anyone who succeeds becomes aware of the hazard, and you can describe to the player characters what they happen to notice. Magical hazards that don't have a minimum proficiency rank can be found using Detect Magic, but when using Detect Magic, it doesn't provide enough information to understand or disable the hazard. All you really get is the fact that a hazard is present in that particular location. You can determine a magical hazard's properties thoroughly enough to disable it by using more powerful magic or a successful skill check, like using Identify Magic or a Recall Knowledge with that specific magical skill. Magical hazards with a minimum proficiency rank cannot be found with Detect Magic at all. Now that we've kind of talked a little bit about what hazards are, I'm going to be going into certain things, triggering a hazard, destroying a hazard, and how to disable a hazard. But I kind of want to talk about what a hazard format would look like. In the actual book itself, it has this kind of last, but I'd rather bring it forward so we can all kind of see and get used to what a hazard looks like. So there is a base hazard format, and it would be the same whether it is a regular hazard, simple hazard, complex hazard, environmental hazard, or a haunt. They're all kind of done this same way. They're presented in a stat block format similar to those used for monsters. And there are a few notes regarding the format from the sample block, and I'll go ahead and throw this up here. Now let's kind of go over this stat block. You are going to have the hazard name and the hazard level on that first line in addition to any traits that it might have. You are going to have a stealth entry, and it's going to list the stealth modifier for a complex hazards initiative or the stealth DC to detect a simple hazard, followed by a minimum proficiency rank if it is required. If you have to use detect magic, it will be in this block as well. Then you're going to get a text description, and the description explains what the hazard looks like, and it might include special rules. So if someone does detect a particular hazard, you will see how to describe it here. Now, below this particular line, you might not always see everything that's in this particular section of the block, but we're going to go over it now so you're aware of what it is. There is going to be a disable block. The disable block is the DC of any skill checks required to disable the hazard. They are going to be listed right here. If it can be counteracted, its spell level and counteract DC are listed in parentheses. And for a haunt, it will be the exact same thing, except the skills you need might be a little bit different. As opposed to a thievery, you're going to see something like religion here instead. AC is the hazard's armor class. It'll also have its saving throws. Usually only haunts are subject to will saves. Now you also have a hardness level, and it is the hardness level just like it would be for a shield. It will have the HP or the hazard's hit points, and if it does have a broken threshold, that broken threshold will be in parentheses. The difference between a hit points and broken threshold, once something hits the broken threshold, then it can no longer be used. It's disabled. Once you reach something's hit points, it is totally destroyed. Some things do not have a broken threshold. If that's the case, you will not see the broken threshold in parentheses in this block. It's also going to have immunities, which is the hazards immunities. A lot of hazards are going to have the same immunities that most items have. It'll also have any weaknesses, if there are any, as well as resistances, once again, if there are any. In a lot of cases, especially for non-haunt hazards, these are just going to be typical item listings here. You are also going to see an action type. It could be a reaction or a free action. This is the reaction or free action the hazard uses. It's going to tell you what the trigger is, how or what sets off the particular hazard, and the effect, and what that effect is going to be. If this is a complex hazard, it will have a routine section, and this entry describes what a complex hazard does on each of its turns during an encounter. One after another, one action after another, it will tell you what it does. The number in parentheses after the word routine indicates how many actions the hazard can use during each turn. So it might not have 3, it might have 2, but it'll be listed here in this section. And simple hazards will not have this entry because they do not have a routine, which is kind of the big differentiator between a simple and a complex hazard. The action section is any action the hazard can use appears here. Typically, this is melee or a ranged strike, and then it will have a reset section at the end. If the hazard can be reset, then that is where you find the information. An example of this, where if you had a trap door, this might be, it can be reset manually. If you had a series of crossbows that were set up on a timer, it would say reset after 1 minute automatically. So this is where you'd find that kind of information there. Now that we kind of have this stat block laid out and a little bit explained, let's talk about triggering a hazard. So we're going to go ahead and get more detail here on each one of these particular sections. So we're going to start with triggering a hazard. If the group fails to detect a hazard and the hazard's trigger is a standard part of traveling, what we mean by that is stepping on a stone or stepping on a pressurized floor plate or moving through some type of magical sensor when walking, the hazard's reaction occurs. Hazards that would be triggered only when someone directly manipulates the environment. And when we talk about that, we're talking about things such as moving a door handle, maybe pulling a book out of a bookshelf, or maybe lifting a plate or a candle off of a table. Use their reactions only if the player character explicitly takes that action. So just because someone walked past a door doesn't mean that the door handle trigger would go off. The door handle actually has to be manipulated for that trigger to go off. Now we're going to talk a little bit about reactions or free actions. So most hazards have reactions that occur when they're triggered. For simple hazards, the reaction is going to be the entire thing that that hazard does and the entire hazard's effect. For complex hazards, the reaction may also cause the hazard to roll for initiative because it is going to start its turn and a series of actions, either starting a combat encounter or joining one that is already in effect. And with this routine, unless it is disabled or destroyed, the hazard will continue to pose a threat over multiple rounds. Some hazards have triggered free actions instead of reaction. For example, quicksand can suck down multiple creatures per round. It doesn't need a reaction, therefore it doesn't waste its reaction. If you happen to step in quicksand, it didn't use its reaction on the first person to walk in. It will just continue to suck people down. Now I want to talk a little bit about routine. So the routine is what separates a simple hazard from a complex hazard. A complex hazard usually follows a set of pre-programmed actions called a routine. Once triggered, the hazard first performs its initial reaction. Then, if the player characters are not yet in encounter mode, it rolls initiative. If they are already in encounter mode, then the complex hazards are just going to join initiative and the initiative order will remain the same. The hazard might tell you to roll initiative for it. If this is the case, the hazard rolls initiative using its stealth modifier. So it would roll a d20 and then add the stealth modifier that's listed in its stat block. After this happens, the hazard follows its routine each round on its initiative unerringly. It's just going to continue doing what its routine is and what it's been programmed to do. The number of actions a hazard can take each round, as well as what they can be used for, depend on the hazard itself. A hazard can be reset, sometimes allowing them to be triggered again. It can occur automatically. As for quicksand, its free action occurs. It doesn't need anything to reset it. It just is ready to go again. So it is automatically able to be triggered again. When the surface settles after 24 hours, therefore it'll be invisible and not able to be seen. Or manually, like a hidden pit whose trapdoor must be closed to the pit before it becomes hidden again. So disabling a hazard is kind of a big part of dealing with hazards. The most versatile method for deactivating traps is the disable a device action of the thievery skill. But most mechanical traps can also simply be smashed, and magical traps can usually be counteracted if you can recognize what they are, what type of magic they use, or what kind of mechanical actions they have. Environmental hazards often can be overcome with nature or survival, and haunts can often be overcome with occultism or religion. The specific skill and DC required to disable a hazard are listed in that hazard's stat block. Like using disable a device, using these skills to disable a trap is a 2-action activity with the same degrees of success, though the activity might have different traits that are determined by the game master. And just like when you're detecting a hazard, disabling a hazard might require a character to have certain proficiency rank in that listed skill. If it is a high-level haunt, you might need a certain level of religion or occultism. If it is a very complex trap, a very complex mechanical trap, you might need expert or master in thievery in order to disable that particular trap. Now, a character must first detect a hazard, or at the very least have it pointed out to them before they can disable a trap. Now, you can attempt to deactivate a trap, whether it has been triggered or not, though some hazards no longer pose a danger once their reactions have occurred. And a good example of this is that pit. Once the trap door has swung down and you're readily aware that that trap door exists, you can disable it if you want to, but it's already kind of disabled because it's open and it has to manually be reset. So as long as you don't reset it, it is in effect disabled. Now, for most hazards, a successful check for the listed skill against the difficulty class in the stat block disables the hazard without triggering it. Any other means of deactivating the hazard are included in the hazard stat block, as are any additional steps required to properly deactivate it. Now, this is where we start getting into some of the success conditions, because a critical failure on any roll to disable a hazard triggers it automatically, including a critical failure on a roll to counteract that magical hazard. So if you do crit fail when you are trying to disable it, then that crit fail follows you through the entire action of that particular hazard. Some hazards who are particularly complex will require multiple successful checks to disable, typically because they have a particularly complicated component or a bunch of discrete parts of it. And you can kind of think of this like picking a lock. A lock might have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or numerous tumblers, and you might have to pick each one, doing a different roll each and every time. That is the case for some hazards. Some hazards will require that same multiple check because they're made up of multiple components. And for hazards with a complex component, a critical success on a check to disable the hazard counts as 2 successes on a single component. So let's say you had something that had 3 different components and each component required 2 separate checks. A critical success gets you past 2 checks of the first component, not the first and the second component, because each one of them has their own 2 checks. Sometimes disabling a hazard isn't something you can do because you don't have the skill required to do it. You might not have someone with a high enough religion or occult, or you might not have someone with high enough thievery to disarm a trap. In that case, you can try to damage a hazard. So rather than trying to carefully disable a hazard, you might just try and smash it. In a lot of cases, that might be the way to go. Damaging a mechanical trap or any other physical hazard works just like damaging objects. The hazard reduces its damage that it takes by its hardness level, just like a shield would. I don't want to say every case, but in most cases, when you hit a hazard, you're going to trigger it. And if the hazard's hit points are reduced to its broken threshold or lower, the hazard becomes broken and can't be activated, but it can still be repaired. If you reduce it all the way down to 0 hit points, at that point it is destroyed and cannot be repaired anymore. Hazards do have, as we kind of talked about this in the stat block, hazards do have an armor class. They do have applicable saving throw modifiers. They have a hardness level. They'll have hit points. They just might have a broken threshold if that is part of its particular stat block. And if it doesn't list one of these statistics, then it can't be affected by anything targeting that statistic. For example, a hazard that has hit points but no broken threshold can't be broken, it can only be destroyed. And we talked about it a little bit when we went through the stat block, but to kind of just say this pretty plainly, most hazards are objects, and as such, they're immune to most things objects are immune to. And they can't be targeted by anything that can't target objects. Some hazards specifically might have additional immunities as well as additional resistances, and they can also have additional weaknesses. A good example of that might be if you had a hazard that required the use of free-flowing sand. If you used water and made it so the sand did not free flow for the weight distribution or something along those lines, then the trap wouldn't work anymore, which would be a unique weakness. Now, if someone hits a hazard, especially if it's a mechanical trap, once again, you usually trigger it, though you might determine otherwise. In some cases, if you totally snapped the bar that is going to launch the javelin at you, in that case, it might still trigger technically, but because the mechanism that throws the javelin is broken, it might not actually work anymore. An attack that breaks the hazard might prevent it from triggering, depending on the circumstances, just like we said. If the hazard has multiple parts, breaking one part might still trigger the trap. For example, if a trap has a tripwire in one location and launches an attack from another location, severing the tripwire might still set that other location's trap off. A good way around this particular thing is if you have a character that's strong enough, destroying a trap in one blow almost never triggers it. This rule applies to most damaging spells and other effects in addition to attacks. So not just physical attacks, spells could do it or any area of effect. There are some cases when you might want to repair a hazard. You might allow a character to repair a damage hazard to restore its functionality. You might not want someone behind you to know that you have been through, so you want to reset that particular trap because it was damaged while you were trying to overcome it. You can determine the specifics of this since it varies by trap. The repair action might be insufficient if fixing the trap requires gathering scattered components or requires replacement of, let's say, a copper wire if you don't have copper to replace it with. If the item has a reset entry, the character needs to do whatever is listed there in addition to repairing the damage. Now, I do quickly want to go into one little aspect here, which is counteracting a magical hazard. Some magical hazards can be counteracted using Dispel Magic and the counteracting rules. The hazard spell levels and counteract difficulty classes are listed in their stat block, and counteracting a hazard otherwise works just like using a skill check to disable a hazard. Now, just like most things that you encounter when you're adventuring, overcoming hazards does get you experience points. Characters gain experience points for overcoming a hazard, whether they disable it, avoid it, or simply assure that it attacks and goes off. You are going to get experience points for it because you survived that particular hazard. If they trigger the same hazard later, you don't gain the experience points from a hazard again, so you can't farm hazard from a particular trap. The XP values for hazards and different levels are kind of in this chart, and I'll throw it right up here. But the XP for a complex hazard is equal to the XP for a monster of the same level, and the experience points for a simple hazard is 1/5 of that experience for a complex hazard. Hazards of lower level than the party's level. So let's say you're a 5th level party and you run into a hazard level 0, you won't gain any experience from that. It has to be party level -4 or above, otherwise it's considered trivial. Let's go ahead and go into some hazards. So here's a couple good simple hazards and one haunt that we're going to go through today. Good simple hazard, Hidden Pit. It's a hazard level 0. It does have the mechanical and the trap trait. It does have a stealth DC of 18 or 0 if the trapdoor is disabled or open, or broken. So if you can see the trapdoor, then its stealth DC is much lower of a 0. Description: wooden trapdoor covers a pit that's 10 feet square and 20 feet deep. To disable it, you need a DC 12 thievery check to remove the trapdoor. It does have an armor class of 10, fortitude save of +1, reflex save of +1. The hardness of the trapdoor is 3. Remember that hardness is listed just like it would be for a shield. The trapdoor hit points is 12 and its broken threshold is 6. Its immunities are critical hits, object immunities, and precision damage. It does have a reaction, and that reaction is Pitfall. The trigger for Pitfall is a creature walks over the trapdoor. The effect: the trigger and creature falls in and takes falling damage, typically 12 bludgeoning damage. That creature can use the grab an edge reaction to avoid falling. If it's not reset, creatures can still fall under the pit. However, the trapdoor must be reset manually for the trap to become hidden again. And that's kind of the reset condition, is it makes it hidden again, where the stealth DC is 18 and not 0. Now, I also kind of wanted to go over a good 0 level simple haunt. So a good 0 level simple haunt is a disembodied voice. It's a hazard level 0. It does have the haunt trait. Stealth DC is 16. Train to feel the breath upon your neck. Description: angry spirits breathe down the necks of intruders and whisper haunting threats or messages in their ears. To disable it, you need a DC 15 religion, trained to ward yourself from evil, or DC 16 performance to drown out the spirit's voices. So if you had a bard, they might be able to play over it in order to disable it. It has a whisper reaction, auditory, emotion, enchantment, fear, mental, and occult traits. Trigger: a creature enters the haunt's area, so nothing more than that. The effect is the haunt deals 1d6 plus 4 mental damage to creatures in the area with a DC 19 basic will save. On a failure, the creature is also frightened 1. This does get reset after 1 hour. So once again, just to kind of show you, a haunt is no different than any other hazard. It has all the same stats. It can be disabled, it can be detected, and it's listed in that particular stat block. Just to kind of illustrate this, we're going to go ahead and do a complex trait for a haunt. And for a haunt, we are going to go ahead and do Entombed Spirit. Entombed Spirit is a hazard 2. It has the complex and the haunt traits. Has a stealth of +11, trained. The description is the wall bulges out in the shape of a howling humanoid face as it twists and forms tendrils reaching for nearby creatures. This haunt is formed when a murder victim is entombed within a wall before or after their death. So now when you see the movies, now you know how that happens. To disable it, you need a DC 17 occultism trained to weaken the spirit, DC 18 athletics trained to force the spirit's face back inside the wall, or a DC 19 diplomacy trained to talk down the spirit. 2 total successes across all skills are required to disable the haunt. So you can do 2 diplomacies, you can do 2 occultisms, or you could do an athletics and diplomacy, or an occultism and athletics in order to disable this trap. AC 15, fortitude +11, and reflex save +5. Hardness is 9, which is just a wall. Hit points 30, breaking threshold is 15. Immunities are object immunities. Its reaction is called Gasp, which is enchantment, fear, mental, and occult. Trigger, a creature moves adjacent to the wall where the corpse is entombed. The effect, the spirit gasps and wails for aid while the wall takes on the shape of its face and roils, growing tendrils. All creatures within 10 feet must succeed a DC 18 will save or be frightened 1 for as long as the haunt remains active. The haunt then rolls initiative. Once again, just like any other complex hazard, it's rolling initiative to start its routine. Its routine is 3 actions. The spirit attempts to grapple up to 2 creatures within 10 feet with a +14 athletics modifier, then squeezes each creature it has grabbed, doing 1d10 +4 damage. The haunt doesn't apply a multiple attack penalty to a second attempt to grapple. It resets by the haunt deactivates 1 minute after all creatures leave the area and resets immediately thereafter. If disabled, the haunt resets after 1 day. The haunt is permanently destroyed if the remains of the deceased are removed from the wall. So you can totally end a haunt in some cases if it has something in the stat block that tells you how to permanently destroy the haunt, which might be possibly one of the only big differences. Now, I do hope you enjoyed this video on hazards and haunts. Once again, I did do a hazard video before, and that hazard video was fine, but it didn't include haunts, and I couldn't see making a separate video for haunts since they are pretty much the same thing. So I do hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, feel free to like, subscribe, or hit that notification bell. But whatever you do, I hope you have a great day and happy adventuring. Thanks.